The wagon had jumped the rails at 6:15 in the morning. Not violently, not the kind of derailment that ends careers and fills reports with words like catastrophic and structural failure. The third freight wagon of the morning timber run had come through the mountain curve at kilometer 14, with a slight shimmy that the locomotive driver, a man named Thays who had been running this line for 9 years, felt through the cab floor as something wrong before he could name what it was. He had brought the train to a stop within 200 meters. When he walked back along the track, the third wagon was sitting with its left wheels on the rails and its right wheels on the granite ballast beside them, tilted at an angle that made the couplings on either side strain in directions they had not been designed to accommodate. Nobody was hurt. The timber load was intact. The wagon had not gone over the embankment. The track, however, was blocked, and between this point and the nearest station in either direction, there was no passing loop, no alternative routing, and no way for any other train to move on the line until the wagon was back on the rails. Werner Fuchs arrived with the district railway engineering team at 8:30. He was 40 years old and had been the district's chief railway engineer since 1957. He came with the recovery vehicle, a heavy rail-mounted crane unit that traveled on the tracks themselves, equipped with hydraulic lifting gear, and the standard re-railing equipment kept at Weilheim for exactly this kind of situation. He had overseen 4 derailment recoveries in his career. He stepped out of the crane cab, looked at the derailed wagon, looked at the curve, looked at the approach geometry, and began to understand that he was looking at a 5th derailment recovery that was going to be different from the first 4. By 10, he had stopped work. The problem was the curve at kilometer 14. If this is your first story here, subscribe now and hit the bell. New story every single day. Let me tell you about the kilometer 14 curve, because the geometry of that specific section of mountain railway is where this entire story lives. The Bergkamp narrow gauge railway had been built between 1901 and 1904 to connect the farming and timber communities of the Upper Valley to the main line at Weilheim. At the time of its construction, it had been an engineering achievement. A single-track line climbing 400 meters in 22 kilometers, threading through terrain that presented rock faces, steep embankments, tight curves, and the specific difficulty of mountain railways everywhere, which is that the minimum curve radius the terrain forces upon you is often considerably tighter than the minimum curve radius your equipment can tolerate without complaint. Kilometer 14 was one of these necessary compromises. The curve had been cut around a granite buttress on the uphill side and ran above a 12-meter embankment drop on the downhill side, and at its tightest point the radius was 42 meters. For a narrow-gauge mountain railway this was acceptable, barely. For the recovery crane, a vehicle with a fixed wheelbase of 7 meters designed for straight track and gentle curves, it was the end of the approach. The recovery crane had traveled 17 kilometers up the mountain line from Weilheim and stopped 20 meters short of the wagon, at the precise point where the curve began to tighten beyond what the crane's wheelbase could safely navigate. Its operator, who had been operating this specific vehicle for 12 years and had an exact working knowledge of what it could and could not do, had set the brake and told Fuchs, "This is as far as I go." From the other direction, through the Bergkamp tunnel, the line was clear, but the crane was on the wrong side of the wagon. Sending it back to Weilheim and around to the far tunnel entrance would require 4 hours at best. The freight schedule for the entire Upper Valley would collapse through the afternoon, and the timber contractors waiting for their delivery had already been calling the station since 7 o'clock. Fuchs had attempted to use the crane's hydraulics from its stop position 20 meters back in the curve. He extended the arm to its maximum reach and applied lateral force to the wagon's displaced wheels. The geometry was wrong. The crane's angle pushed the wheels further onto the ballast rather than back toward the rail. He tried twice. On the second attempt, the wagon shifted 6 centimeters in the wrong direction. Fuchs had stopped and stood on the track looking at the result without speaking. He had considered using the locomotive as a pulling device. The locomotive's couplers were designed for axial traction, not for the lateral force that re-railing required. The physics were not workable. He had walked the embankment below the wagon. He had walked the uphill side. He had called the regional engineering office. He had stood on the track for a long time looking at the rock face above the track on the uphill side, and had noticed, partially concealed under 50 years of moss and low vegetation, a flat shelf of compacted stone running along the inside of the curve approximately 60 centimeters above the rail level, 2 meters wide, running from just past the start of the curve to a point beyond the wagon's position. He had looked at it for a long time without being able to identify what it was. He did not know what it was. Heinrich Gruber knew. Heinrich Gruber was 63 years old and had been farming the land at Kilometer 12, 2 kilometers down the mountain line from the derailment, since 1935. His farm bordered the railway for 4 kilometers. He had watched trains on the Bergkamp line pass his window every morning and evening for 26 years, with the untroubled familiarity of a man who lives beside something long enough to stop consciously registering it. He had known about the stone maintenance shelf at Kilometer 14 since October of 1942, when a retired railway worker named Ritter, already in his late 70s, already very old, walking the line in the way old railway men walk lines they spent their lives on, had stopped him one morning near the Kilometer 13 marker and pointed up at the rock face above the track. Ritter had worked on the original construction crew in 1903. He had been 17 years old when the Bergkamp line was built and had spent 4 subsequent decades as a track maintenance worker on the same line. The stone shelf at Kilometer 14, he explained to Heinrich that morning in 1942, had been cut by the construction crew as a working platform during the installation of the tight curve section. They had needed a stable, elevated surface to work from while laying the curved track, somewhere a man could stand with his tools above the track level without being in the way of the track-laying machinery. They had cut it into the granite in 3 weeks. When the track installation was complete, they had left it. Nobody removed construction infrastructure on a mountain railway when the infrastructure was made of solid granite. The shelf had stayed there, slowly buried under moss and low scrub. Ritter had said, "If you ever need to bring a horse or a light cart to the uphill side of the Kilometer 14 curve, the shelf is solid. I worked from it for 3 weeks in 1903. The stone is good granite. It will hold a horse and cart, possibly a small tractor." Heinrich had thanked him and filed this information in the part of his memory that held things that were not immediately useful but might eventually matter. He had never needed a 2-meter granite shelf above the track at the Kilometer 14 curve. He had never consciously thought about it again. When he walked the 2 kilometers to the derailment scene at 9:30 and saw the recovery crane stopped 20 meters from the wagon and Werner Fuchs standing on the track, with the expression of a man who has exhausted his prepared responses. 19 years of accumulated nothing resolved into something specific and immediate. He walked to where Fuchs was standing. "There is a stone maintenance shelf above the track on the uphill side of the Kilometer 14 curve," he said. "Cut during the original construction in 1903, 2 meters wide, running from the start of the curve to a point beyond the wagon. It will hold the Lanz." Fuchs looked at him. He looked at the shelf, the one he had been studying without being able to identify. He looked at the Lanz, which Heinrich had not yet brought and which was at this moment in the barn 2 kilometers down the track. "A farm tractor on a stone shelf above a railway track," Fuchs said. He said it carefully, in the manner of a man who does not want to dismiss something before he has fully considered it, but who is finding full consideration difficult. "To accomplish what?" "From the shelf, the winch angle is directly above the displaced right wheels," Heinrich said. "That is the angle you need to push the wheels back toward the rail head. You cannot achieve that angle from the track level. The crane cannot achieve it from 20 meters back in the curve. The shelf gives you the correct geometry." Fuchs looked at the shelf. He looked at the crane. He looked at the wagon and at the angle from the crane's current position and at the angle from the shelf above. He looked at Heinrich Gruber, 63 years old, flat cap, work jacket, standing on a mountain railway track with the bearing of a man who has already calculated the outcome and is simply waiting. One of the railway workers said something to the man beside him. Both looked at the Lanz and then at Fuchs. Fuchs looked at the wagon. He looked at his list of options, which had not grown since the last time he consulted it. "How long?" he said. "An hour, perhaps less." "All right," Fuchs said. "Let me tell you what Heinrich Gruber understood about the geometry of this derailment that Fuchs's technical knowledge could not supply, because this is the mechanical truth of what happens next. Rerailing a wagon whose wheels have left the rails is not, in principle, a task requiring enormous force. The wheels must be moved laterally, from their current position on the ballast, back onto the top of the rail head, and then pushed slightly downward so the wheel flange seats against the inside of the rail. On flat ground with open access, this can sometimes be done with levers and blocks. The force required is real but not exceptional. On a mountain curve with an embankment below and a rock face above, the problem is not the force required. The problem is the angle. A winch pulling from the wrong angle cannot rerail a wagon regardless of how much force it applies. Wrong angle, more force only moves the wagon further in the wrong direction, which is what had happened to Fuchs's second crane attempt. The correct angle for this specific wagon, displaced to the right side of the rail, was a force coming from above and slightly inboard, a line of pull running from approximately 1 meter above the rail head and half a meter inboard of the displaced wheel's current position. That line, at approximately 35 degrees from horizontal, applied simultaneously. The lateral component needed to move the wheels toward the rail, and the downward component needed to seat the flange. From the track level, 20 meters back in the curve, the crane could only apply force along the track axis. Wrong direction entirely. From the maintenance shelf, 60 centimeters above rail level, running along the inside of the curve, the Lanz's winch drum was in almost exactly the required position. The geometry that was physically impossible from the track was naturally present from the 1903 construction platform that had been waiting in the granite for 58 years. Heinrich had not calculated this in degrees. He had looked at the wagon, looked at the shelf, and understood the geometry the way he understood the geometry of everything on this mountainside. Through 50 years of practical work on terrain where the available angles were never theoretical and always mattered. Subscribe now if you have not yet. What happens at Kilometer 14 in the next hour is the reason the Bergkamp line still remembers Heinrich Gruber. He heated the glue kopf on the maintenance shelf. The shelf was exactly 2 meters wide and felt narrower, not because of any physical difference, but because 2 meters of granite above a railway track in a tight mountain curve occupied the mine differently from 2 meters of field. The Lanz sat on the shelf with approximately 30 centimeters of clearance on the rock face side, and the track 60 centimeters below the downhill edge. Heinrich did not look at the track below. He looked at the iron. 7 minutes. The cast iron hot bulb chamber at the base of the engine absorbed the torch's heat with the patience that cold iron always brings to this process slowly, the color arriving when it was ready. The dull red-orange he had been reading since his father showed him what it meant. He set the blowtorch aside. He lifted the starting crank, turned it once. The flywheel moved. He turned it again, fully committed. On the third turn, the engine fired. Pum! Then the silence of a mountain in October. The sound of the engine going into the rock face and returning changed. The mountain giving it back transformed. Then pum! The flywheel had its rhythm. Pum pum pum. 1 beat per second on a granite construction shelf above a narrow-gauge mountain railway in 1961. The exhaust pipe sent its thread of dark smoke into the cold October air. Werner Fuchs, standing on the track below, watched the flywheel. His railway workers had positioned themselves where they could see both the wagon's displaced wheels and the cable from above. Nobody was saying anything. Heinrich attached the winch cable to the underframe of the derailed wagon at the crossmember directly below the displaced right axle. He tested the connection. He walked back up to the Lanz. He climbed on. Hit subscribe news story every single day, and this moment is the heart of it. He engaged the winch drum. Pum pum pum. The cable tightened. The engine note did not change. The flywheel turned at its steady pace, the torque between strokes absorbed and released with the smooth patience that had been designed into the machine at the Mannheim factory and had been working on behalf of difficult situations ever since. The cable went from slack to taut. For 3 seconds, nothing moved except the flywheel and the winch drum. Then the displaced right wheels moved. 4 centimeters, in the correct direction, toward the rail head. The cable's angle, the angle that came from the shelf position, the angle that had been geometrically impossible from the track, was pushing the wheel laterally toward the rail and slightly downward simultaneously. Both force components at once, because the angle was right. Fuchs was watching from the track below. He watched the cable's line. He thought, in the way engineers think when watching something work that their analysis had not predicted, about angle and force and position and the relationship between them. 4 more centimeters. The right front wheel was now in contact with the top of the rail head. The wheel flange was approaching the inside face of the rail. Heinrich held the throttle exactly where it was. The flywheel absorbed the resistance between strokes and kept turning. The pull was steady, not pulsing, not surging, the slow, continuous accumulation of force that was the single-cylinder engine's particular character. The wheel flange found the rail. The right rear wheel followed. Once the front wheel had provided the reference point against the rail's inside face, the wagon's own slight downhill tilt helped guide the rear into alignment. The geometry completing itself, the way geometry completes itself when the angle is correct. Both wheels of the right axle were back on the rail. Heinrich disengaged the winch. He unclipped the cable. He drove the Lanz back along the maintenance shelf to the descent point and brought it down to the trackside path. Fuchs's recovery crane, working from its position 20 meters back in the curve, could now approach the second axle. With one axle re-railed, the geometry was manageable. The hydraulics worked with the situation. The crew completed the full re-railing in 35 minutes. The line was clear at noon. Pum pum, pum. The Lanz drove back down the mountain path toward the farm. Fuchs came to Heinrich's farm that afternoon. Heinrich was in the barn. He heard the car came to the door, watched the railway authority vehicle pull into the yard. Fuchs got out still wearing his railway jacket, documents under his arm. He had not gone back to Weilheim first. Gruber, he said. Heinrich waited. The shelf, Fuchs said. I noticed it myself. I could not identify what it was. Construction platform, Heinrich said. 1903. A retired worker named Ritter told me in 1942 he was part of the original construction crew. Fuchs looked at the barn, at the Lanz, at Heinrich. How did you know the angle would work? I looked at where the wheels were and where the shelf was, Heinrich said. The line between them was the angle needed. That is all. Fuchs said, I had a recovery crane, hydraulic equipment, and technical specifications for this exact type of derailment. I had the wrong angle. You had the wrong position, Heinrich said. The angle follows from the position. A silence between them. The shelf is in no document, Fuchs said. Not in the track survey, not in the infrastructure records, not in the maintenance files. Ritter knew it was there, Heinrich said. He told me. One retired worker told one farmer, Fuchs said, in 1942. Yes, Heinrich said simply. Fuchs picked up his documents and extended his hand. Heinrich shook it. Neither said what didn't need to be said. The Kilometer 14 maintenance shelf was surveyed by the Railway Authority in November of 1961 and added to the infrastructure records as Maintenance Access Platform KM14, load rating 3,500 kilograms, granite construction, origin 1903, condition excellent. Heinrich Gruber's name did not appear in the survey document. The Bergkamp line ran until 1978, when it was closed as part of Bavaria's narrow-gauge rationalization. In the line's final 17 years, the Kilometer 14 shelf was used 3 more times for track maintenance access, each time by workers who had been told about it by the generation before them. When the line closed, nobody removed the platform. The granite is still there. Heinrich Gruber farmed Kilometer 12 until 1971. The Lanz Bulldog stayed on the farm. When his son Georg took over, he kept the machine for the same work his father had always used it for. When people asked Georg about the derailment at Kilometer 14, he said, "My father knew about a stone shelf the railway engineers didn't know about, and the shelf gave him the angle, and the angle was everything." The Lance fired on the third turn of the crank every spring until 1981. Pum pum pum. Some knowledge is not in any document because no one thought to write it down at the time. And by the time someone thought to write it down, the person who knew it had passed it to one other person in a passing conversation on a mountain track. And that person had kept it in the part of their memory that holds things that might eventually matter. The maintenance shelf at Kilometer 14 was cut by men who needed it for 3 weeks in 1903 and left it because removing granite is harder than leaving it. It was used in 1961 by a farmer who knew it was there because an old man had mentioned it 19 years earlier. It was used 3 more times by men who learned it from the men before them. Old iron holds old knowledge, old stone holds it longer. And when the recovery crane was in the wrong position and the railway was stopped, and the engineers were looking at their specifications and finding nothing useful, the answer was 2 kilometers down the track in a barn on a mountain farm, patient, maintained, ready on the third turn of the crank, waiting for the morning when the geometry was finally right.